Let's talk US politics. It is an election year this year. How does the US election impact or not impact the decarbonisation space?
Yeah, it is an election year. It's going to get pretty noisy through the back part of 2024. For the most part, we don't think that a Trump presidency would do too much to decarbonisation spending. It's important to recognise that Trump would actually be somewhat positive for certain parts of the market and for US corporates. But then obviously he has historically taken a bit of a negative view of particularly some of the renewables and particularly some of the EVs. So there is some risk around him rolling back the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a really nice piece of legislation for a lot of these renewable companies. And so that would be a headwind from that perspective. But on the other side, there's some potential positive for these companies as well, or some of these companies anyway. So he's talking about cutting taxes again. So that's a positive for pretty much every corporate because their tax rate's lower. He would also probably ramp up the trade war. So he'd make it easier for US companies to compete against Chinese imports. And so that could potentially be a benefit for some of these US climate companies. Deregulation, he might pull some of the powers of the EPA, or at least dilute the EPA. So maybe some of those sort of hazardous waste stocks that we were talking about, might have less of an opportunity. But on the other side, they might be allowed to buy more, i.e. consolidate their markets more. Whereas the administration in place at the moment has obviously blocked a lot of deals, corporate deals. So that's potential. There's some positives and some potential negatives from Trump there. But the biggest piece of the risk would be the IRA repeal. It will be hard for him to do. Like, he's going to need a clean sweep, and then even within a clean sweep, it's going to need to be a pretty big majority for the Republicans, because if it's quite tight, it's going to be hard to repeal it anyway. Then we can obviously talk about the parts that he will repeal. He likes some parts of the IRA, well, not the IRA specifically, but he likes some parts of decarbonisation. But obviously he doesn't like wind and EVs. So yeah, happy to dive into that as well.
So let's talk about that more. What areas does Trump like and not like?
Yeah, so he doesn't like electric vehicles. So he doesn't like subsidies on electric vehicles because basically it's politically seen as providing policy support to a consumer that doesn't need help, basically. So if you're got enough income to buy an electric vehicle, he doesn't like basically supporting that cohort. And obviously he prefers internal combustion engine as well. So that part will come under pressure potentially because you won't get those subsidies, or he'd make it hard to get those subsidies. So that's a potential risk there. He's spoken about wind, his dislike of wind and intermittency. So again, that would be an area that he probably doesn't like. But there are a whole bunch of areas that we think play into climate that he actually has no view on, or he would actually be net supportive of. So spoke about nuclear. We expect that would be bipartisan. So that nuclear PTC within the IRA, we would expect that wouldn't get wound back or diluted. Clean hydrogen would be another area because that often is a tailwind for some of the traditional energy companies. So we would expect that to be supported. Carbon capture would be supported. And then, as I said, sort of the biggest piece of the spending pie is going to be this energy efficiency piece. And so they tend to be supportive of the industrial companies that play into that because it's just the old school industrial heating and cooling companies, lighting companies, etc. So we would expect that a lot of those sort of policies would remain in place. Beyond that, obviously as well, when you're talking about decarbonisation, you're often talking about a lot of these projects going into rural areas. And so rural areas tend to be slanted more Republican in the US. So if he's repealing some of these pieces of policy support, the companies are really obviously bullish on this as well. And they want to put projects, or they want to start projects. And often a lot of the times these projects are in these Republican areas. So it's not necessarily in the interests of the other Republican senators, congressmen, etc., to basically go along with Trump and want these things repealed. So a lot of the benefits are accruing to Republican areas. So we do think that he will ultimately support some of these projects.